They still had planes. They still had fuel. Barely. But by 1944, Germany's greatest weapon, the Luftwaffe, was dying from something no engine could fix. They were out of pilots. Once, they ruled the skies, from Poland to Paris, from Crete to Stalingrad. Their aces had hundreds of kills, but by the time of D-Day, brand new fighters sat on runways, with no one left trained to fly them. Today, we'll uncover the quiet collapse of the Luftwaffe, not through explosions, but through exhaustion. The story of how Germany lost the air war long before the Allies reached Berlin. Chapter 1. The Golden Age of the Aces, 1939 to 1941. In the beginning, the sky belonged to them. To the world, they were the new knights of a mechanical age, their engines roaring like trumpets of conquest. In 1939, when the Luftwaffe launched its first attacks over Poland, Germany possessed not only one of the most advanced air forces on Earth, but the most experienced pilots in the world. They were young, confident, and trained to perfection. Many had already fought in Spain, flying for Franco's nationalists during the Spanish Civil War. There, they had learned the art of aerial combat, dive, fire, roll, and climb, tactics refined in real war, not theory. Names like Werner Mulders, Adolf Galland, and Helmut Wick became legends before the war had truly begun. When the Blitzkrieg thundered into motion, these men ruled the air. Over Poland, the Luftwaffe destroyed entire air forces in days. Over France, they annihilated Allied squadrons before they could even form up. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was faster, climbed higher, and dived harder than almost anything it faced. For the first 2 years of the war, the Luftwaffe felt invincible. But hidden beneath the victories was a flaw, invisible, silent, and fatal. The Luftwaffe had no rotation system. Its best pilots stayed on the front lines day after day, month after month, until they were shot down, burned out, or dead. The British and Americans would later rotate their airmen home after a set number of missions, to rest, to teach, to train the next generation. Germany never did. The same men who fought over Warsaw also fought over Paris, over London, and eventually over Stalingrad. Every victory that made them heroes also robbed the Luftwaffe of its future instructors. Göring and his generals believed it was unnecessary. Why pull an ace from combat when he could keep killing? Why slow production of victories when the Reich demanded endless triumphs? By the summer of 1940, that arrogance had consequences. During the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe lost more than 1,700 aircraft and thousands of aircrew. For every British pilot shot down, there was another waiting to replace him, trained, rested, rotated back from Canada, the U.S., or the Commonwealth. For Germany, there was no such reserve. Every loss in the air was permanent. Every fallen ace meant one less mentor for the next class of recruits. And because so many of their instructors were still flying, Luftwaffe flight schools began to slow, and then to stall. But in 1940, no one in Berlin cared. The propaganda films showed pilots grinning beside their Messerschmitts, medals glinting, ground crews cheering. They were gods of the sky, and the sky still belonged to them. Adolf Galland once said, "To fly is to be free, and to fight is to live." But freedom had a cost. Even as they celebrated over the English Channel, even as they toasted their victories in champagne and cigars, the Luftwaffe's pilot corps was bleeding itself dry. The golden age of the aces was not an age of growth. It was a fire burning too brightly, consuming its own fuel. Every day brought more victories, but fewer men left to teach them. And though no one could see it yet, Germany's greatest air force was already dying, not from the enemy's guns, but from its own success. Chapter 2. The Grinding Fronts, 1941 to 1942. By 1941, the aces who had once danced over the skies of Europe were no longer fighting for glory. They were fighting for survival. The Luftwaffe, stretched across a continent, was now paying the price of its own triumphs. When Hitler's armies turned east in June 1941, the German pilots followed them into a new kind of war. One fought not over cities or coastlines, but across an endless ocean of steppe and snow. The Eastern Front was a graveyard for aircraft. Distances were enormous, the weather merciless, and the enemy endless. At first, the Luftwaffe dominated. The Soviet Air Force, caught by surprise, lost thousands of planes in the opening weeks. German pilots scored kills so fast that they stopped counting. In the summer skies over Minsk and Smolensk, men like Hartmann, Barkhorn, and Rudel carved their names into history. But the victories were deceptive. Every kill came at a cost, in engines, in nerves, in irreplaceable experience. The Luftwaffe's logistics chains couldn't keep up. Airfields were primitive. Planes froze solid in winter. Engines seized. Mechanics slept beside aircraft just to keep them from being buried in snow. And every pilot killed or captured on the Eastern Front was gone forever. No replacement. No rotation. The Expert 10 system, the cult of the ace, that had made the Luftwaffe so deadly in 1939, was now turning into a death trap. Meanwhile, far to the south, new fronts were opening. In North Africa, German air units fought under a sun that melted metal. Pilots flew from sand-covered strips, refueling with fuel that had crossed half the world. In the Mediterranean, they chased British convoys, fighting over Malta, Crete, and Tobruk. Battles fought hundreds of miles from supply lines, where a single mechanical failure could mean death in the desert. For the first time, the cracks in the Luftwaffe's invincibility began to show. Everywhere they fought, they were outnumbered. Everywhere the war got larger, the distances longer, the missions more exhausting. The training schools back in Germany tried to replace the losses, but the front always demanded more. By late 1941, Göring began pulling instructors out of flight schools to fill squadrons. The best teachers, the men who knew how to fight and survive, were gone. Their replacements were officers with barely half their flight hours. A young German cadet who once received 240 hours of training before combat was now lucky to get 160. And still, the orders came, sortie after sortie, attack after attack. No rest, no rotation, no relief. Fuel was the new battlefield. Every liter mattered. By 1942, the Luftwaffe was consuming fuel faster than Germany could refine it. Pilots were ordered to practice in the classroom, to simulate dogfights on blackboards, to memorize maneuvers they'd never flown. The exhaustion began to break even the best of them. Helmut Wick, the youngest major in the Luftwaffe with over 50 kills, was shot down and killed in December 1940. Werner Mulders, the architect of modern fighter tactics, died in a transport crash the next year. One by one, the golden generation vanished, and with them went something even more valuable than experience, the belief that victory was inevitable. By the time the Luftwaffe faced the Red Air Force over Stalingrad, the myth of the invincible German pilot had already begun to fade. For the first time, they were fighting an enemy who could afford to lose, and they could not. The skies of the Eastern Front were vast, empty, and cold. In those skies, the Luftwaffe was learning a brutal truth. It wasn't running out of courage. It was running out of time. Chapter 3. Factories without flyers, 1943. By 1943, Germany's skies still roared with the sound of new engines, but fewer hands were left to guide them. From the outside, the Reich seemed unstoppable. The factories of Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, and Junkers were working day and night. New aircraft poured from the assembly lines in record numbers. The latest Bf-109G series, the sleek FW-190A, and experimental prototypes that promised to reclaim the sky. To the German public, the propaganda film showed endless formations of gleaming fighters and proud young pilots marching toward their aircraft. But the truth was far darker. Behind every shining machine, there was a growing emptiness, a desperate shortage of trained men to fly them. The Luftwaffe was eating itself alive. The Eastern Front consumed its veterans. The Mediterranean Front demanded constant reinforcement. And now a new storm was forming in the West, the U.S. 8th Air Force. By early 1943, hundreds of American bombers were crossing into German airspace every week. B-17S and B-24s flew higher, farther, and in tighter formation than anything the Luftwaffe had faced before. For the first time, German pilots were forced into a defensive war, one they were not prepared to fight. Goering promised that no enemy bomber would ever reach Germany's cities. But they did, in waves of hundreds. To stop them, the Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the air, and in the process, it destroyed itself. In February 1943, pilot losses began to outpace training for the first time. By summer, the Luftwaffe was losing 1,000 men per month. For every 10 pilots who went up, only 7 returned, and there were no reserves. The training schools, once the pride of German aviation, were running on fumes. Fuel shortages slashed flight hours. Cadets who once trained for months were now being sent into combat after only 80 to 100 hours in the air. Barely enough to take off, navigate, and land safely. Instructors were gone, reassigned to the front, or killed there. Young men trained by barely older men, a chain of ignorance stretching toward disaster. Meanwhile, Allied production dwarfed everything Germany could achieve. In 1943 alone, the United States produced over 86,000 aircraft. Britain, another 26,000. Germany built fewer than 26,000 fighters and lost nearly half of them. The numbers told the story of collapse. On paper, the Luftwaffe still looked formidable. In reality, it was hollow, a shell of aluminum and propaganda. In the summer of 1943, the Allies launched Operation Point Blank, the systematic destruction of German aviation. Factories, fuel plants, and training schools were bombed relentlessly. Then came Big Week, February 20th to 25th, 1944, when the Americans sent more than 3,000 bombers and 3,500 escort fighters deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them and was nearly annihilated. In 6 days, Germany lost over 600 aircraft and 18% of its trained fighter pilots. 18% gone in a week. It was a wound the Luftwaffe would never recover from. By the end of 1943, Germany had more planes than pilots, more ambition than fuel, and more arrogance than answers. The factories were still running. The propaganda reels still rolled. But in the silence of the training schools, in the empty bunks of the flight barracks, the truth was spreading. The Luftwaffe wasn't losing the war because of its machines. It was losing it because it had run out of men. Chapter 4. The Allied Flood, 1944. By 1944, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. They belonged to the enemy, an enemy that came not in dozens, but in thousands. Every morning, the drone of Allied bombers rolled across the horizon like thunder. The Americans by day, the British by night, an unending rhythm of destruction that Germany could no longer silence. And when the Luftwaffe tried to rise and fight, it was met by something even more terrifying than the bombers themselves, the flood of Allied fighters that followed them. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and worst of all, the sleek, deadly P-51 Mustang, the plane that could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was fast, it could dive, it could climb, and it never ran out of fuel. The Luftwaffe, once feared across the world, was now outnumbered more than 10-1. In June 1944, the Allies fielded over 10,000 operational aircraft in Western Europe. The Luftwaffe could muster barely 1,500. But the real disaster wasn't the numbers in the sky. It was the numbers in the classrooms. Germany's pilot training program was collapsing. A young American or British pilot received between 250 and 300 flight hours before combat. A German recruit by 1944 averaged just 110 hours, sometimes less than 60. Fuel shortages forced instructors to replace flight time with lectures, diagrams, even wooden mock-up cockpits. Some cadets never fired their guns until their first combat mission. They took off with hearts pounding and hands shaking, barely able to control their aircraft, and within minutes they were dead. The average life expectancy of a new German fighter pilot in mid-1944 was 11 days. 11. Over Normandy, that number was even lower. When the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the Luftwaffe could barely respond. While Allied aircraft flew 14,000 sorties on D-Day, the Germans managed fewer than 300. A few desperate formations tried to attack the invasion beaches. Most were shot down before they even saw them. The balance of the air war had flipped completely. Allied pilots were now the hunters, flying high above their targets, waiting for the few remaining Germans to rise. When they did, they were trapped, outnumbered, outgunned, and outtrained. Even Goering could see it. In a fit of rage, he demanded that every able-bodied man be sent to the front. He accused his generals of cowardice, his pilots of weakness, but no amount of shouting could refill the fuel tanks or bring back the veterans buried in foreign fields. Germany's skies were filling with ghosts. Pilots barely out of school, sent to die in the name of a regime that still believed it could win through willpower alone. By late 1944, the Allied air forces were no longer fighting an equal opponent. They were fighting gravity, time, and the remnants of a broken system. Entire squadrons of German aircraft sat grounded, not for lack of planes, but for lack of pilots or fuel to train them. Bombers roamed over the Reich unchallenged, attacking refineries, railways, and cities with mechanical precision. One American pilot later said, "By the time we reached Berlin, the Luftwaffe was already dead. We were just burying it." And yet, in Berlin, the propaganda reels still played. Smiling recruits saluted beneath banners proclaiming victory or death. But on the front lines, those words were no longer a choice. They were a prediction. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was collapsing in slow motion, crushed not by courage, but by arithmetic. The skies of Europe were now an ocean, and the Luftwaffe was drowning in it. Chapter 5. The Jet Mirage, 1944 to 1945. By late 1944, Germany's last hope was no longer its pilots. It was its technology. As Allied bombers darkened the sky, Hitler promised a miracle weapon that would turn the tide. He called it Die Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon, and for a brief moment, the German people believed him. That miracle had a name, the Messerschmitt Me-262. It was sleek, silver, and impossibly fast, the world's first operational jet fighter. While Allied pilots struggled to reach 400 miles per hour, the Me-262 could exceed 540. It could outrun anything in the sky, climb like a rocket, and carry cannons that could shred a bomber in seconds. Even American engineers who examined it after the war called it decades ahead of its time. But the Luftwaffe didn't have decades. It didn't even have months. When the first Me-262 squadrons became operational in mid-1944, Germany was already collapsing. The skies were swarming with Allied fighters. Fuel depots were bombed daily. Training fields were craters. And the few surviving veteran pilots were either dead, captured, or exhausted. The miracle weapon had arrived, but there was no one left to fly it. Of the 1,400 Me-262s built, fewer than 300 ever reached combat. The rest sat on runways with empty tanks or were destroyed by Allied bombs before their first flight. Hitler himself crippled the program further. He demanded that the Me-262 be used as a bomber, not a fighter, an obsession born from his fantasy of striking London again. For months, the jet's deployment was delayed, while engineers tried to redesign it to carry bombs instead of chasing bombers. When it finally reached squadrons like JG-7, it was already too late. The few pilots who flew it described the experience as flying a lightning bolt, but a fragile one. The engines lasted only 25 flight hours before failure. If a pilot accelerated too fast, the turbines tore themselves apart. And if he slowed down too much, the jet became an easy target during takeoff and landing, where Allied fighters waited like wolves. The Me-262 could change the sky, but it couldn't change the math. Every lost pilot was irreplaceable. Every new machine demanded hundreds of man-hours, tons of scarce metals, and thousands of gallons of fuel Germany no longer had. The same story repeated across the Luftwaffe's miracle programs. The rocket-powered Me-163 Comet, capable of climbing faster than any aircraft in history, but running out of fuel in 5 minutes. The Heinkel, He-162, built from plywood and desperation, flown by boys barely 17 years old. The Arado 234, a jet bomber so advanced it could escape pursuit, but had no strategic purpose left to serve. These were the machines of a dying empire, technological marvels built atop ruins. Allied pilots respected their speed, but pitied their pilots. When a jet appeared, entire squadrons turned to chase it, not out of fear, but curiosity. And when they caught it, they often found it unarmed, untrained, or on fire from its own engines. One captured German officer summed it up best. "We built the future, but we built it in hell." By 1945, even the miracle weapons could not hide the truth. The Luftwaffe wasn't an air force anymore. It was a graveyard of innovation. Planes without fuel, hangars without roofs, pilots without hope. The last surviving aces, men who had once ruled the sky, flew until they could no longer find a place to land. They watched the empire they had defended vanish beneath them, bombed into dust. And when the order came to destroy their own aircraft before the Allies arrived, many couldn't do it. They simply sat in silence, engines cold, wings gleaming in the twilight of a war that had already ended. The jet age had begun, but the Luftwaffe would not live to see it. Chapter 6. The Collapse. Spring, 1945. By the spring of 1945, the once mighty Luftwaffe was not dying. It was already dead. Only the noise of engines remained, scattered and faint, echoing through a sky that no longer belonged to Germany. Fuel was gone. Pilots were gone. Hope was gone. Airfields that once buzzed with hundreds of aircraft now stood silent, littered with wreckage and abandoned machines. Instructors who had once trained the finest flyers in the world were teaching children how to start an engine. 17-year-olds, boys with no flight hours, no combat experience, and no future. They called them Hitlerjugend pilots. They wore flight suits that didn't fit, helmets too large for their heads, and were told that their sacrifice would save the fatherland. But every mission was a suicide. The Luftwaffe no longer controlled the sky. It barely survived within it. Fuel shortages had become so desperate that some aircraft were towed to the runway by horses. Others were loaded with just enough fuel for takeoff and a single pass over the enemy. Many never returned, not because they were shot down, but because they ran out of fuel on the way home. For those who still fought, the psychological toll was unbearable. Veterans who had survived hundreds of missions over Britain and Russia now flew alongside terrified boys who could barely read their instruments. They watched them take off and vanish, never to return, day after day. One German ace wrote in his diary, "We no longer fly to win. We fly because not flying would mean we have already surrendered." In the cities below, Allied bombers roamed unchallenged. Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, names that had once symbolized power, now burned night after night. The sky that had once been Germany's greatest weapon had become its grave. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe could put fewer than 300 fighters into the air to defend the entire Reich. The Allies could field over 14,000. Even when a few German aircraft managed to take off, their targets were already hidden beneath waves of smoke and flame. The sky had turned from blue to gray, a permanent shadow cast by defeat. When American and British troops captured Luftwaffe airfields, they found runways scattered with wrecks, Me-262s, FW-190, Bf-109, all burned by their own crews. The hangars were filled with brand-new aircraft that had never flown. No fuel, no pilots, no future. In the end, it wasn't the Allies who destroyed the Luftwaffe. It was time. Every lost veteran, every bombed refinery, every wasted liter of fuel was a countdown to silence. On May 8, 1945, the war ended. And for the first time in 6 years, Europe's skies were still. No engines, no contrails, no thunder of wings, just silence. The sky that had finally run out of men, the Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's empire, had vanished, not in glory, but in exhaustion. Its aces were dead, its youth buried in wreckage, its dream of dominance dissolved into the clouds it could no longer reach. As one surviving pilot later said, "In the end, the Luftwaffe didn't lose the war in the air. It lost it in the classrooms, in the fuel tanks, and in the hearts of boys who never had a chance." Epilogue. When the sky fell silent. The war ended not with a final battle, but with silence. For 6 years, the skies over Europe had roared with engines, burned with fire, and echoed with the cries of men fighting for air superiority. And then, nothing. When the guns fell quiet in May 1945, the survivors of the Luftwaffe walked across airfields that looked like cemeteries. Shattered hangars, craters where runways had been, rows of burned-out aircraft, their wings broken, their insignias fading in the rain. Many of the men who had once flown among the clouds were now prisoners, their uniforms stripped, their medals confiscated. Some refused to believe it was over. Others were simply relieved that they would never have to fly again. The few who lived long enough to tell their stories would later speak of the final months as a kind of living nightmare, a war where courage no longer mattered, where skill meant nothing, and where the only thing stronger than fear was fatigue. They had been trained to fight the enemy in front of them, but no one had prepared them for the slow death of their own Air Force. The Allied interrogators who interviewed captured pilots found no defiance left in them, just exhaustion and disbelief that their Air Force, once the most advanced in the world, had ended like this. Destroyed not by superior tactics, but by an enemy that could simply build more, fly more, and last longer. The proud Knights of the Air, the men who once saw themselves as modern crusaders, were now relics of a vanished age. Their machines had been faster, their uniforms sharper, their confidence absolute. But the world had changed. Industrial war had turned flying from an art into arithmetic, and in that arithmetic, Germany could never win. The sky, that vast blue stage of glory and death, no longer belonged to them. The new masters were the bombers, the Mustangs, the Thunderbolts, the symbols of a new kind of warfare where machines, not men, decided fate. For years after the war, the surviving pilots would meet in quiet reunions, old enemies sharing drinks and stories. British, American, German, it no longer mattered. They had all lost friends to the same sky. They spoke of the sound of the engines, the smell of fuel, the feeling of control, and the moment it all disappeared. One German ace, interviewed decades later, put it simply: the Luftwaffe did not lose because we were outflown. We lost because we ran out of everything: fuel, pilots, hope. In the end, the sky itself turned against us. The day the Luftwaffe ran out of pilots wasn't one single day. It was a slow, invisible collapse, measured not in minutes or missions, but in the fading of experience, one pilot at a time. Every lost veteran meant one less teacher. Every crash meant another secret lost forever, until there was no one left who remembered how to fly. And so, when the last engines went quiet, and the last contrails dissolved into the gray sky of a ruined Europe, it marked the end of more than a war. It marked the end of an era, the moment when the age of the ace gave way to the age of the machine. The sky fell silent, and the silence said everything. Stay healthy, subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and see you in the next one. And if you have an idea for another untold story, share it in the comments. Your voice helps keep their memory alive.